Jim Tracy, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
All right, man. Thanks. What an honor to be here. Thank you so much for asking me. It's a treasure.
You are a business person. What are some of the businesses you've founded, owned, and or managed over the years?
Yeah, wow. Great question. I'm so old, I got a lot of answers. The first real significant job I ever had, I was in my early 30s, and I was put in charge of a engineered wood manufacturing plant that wasn't doing very well. And we were able to boost the sales and then move it from sales just domestically over to the Pacific Rim and started manufacturing and did a few acquisitions. So we were able to turn that around. And then my son and I founded Legacy Telecommunications back in 99. And that was a company that was in the development and construction of wireless communications towers, or some people call them cell towers, but wireless infrastructure of various kinds. And then from there, we also launched a couple of real estate businesses and have just, really, I think I just have to do a tip of the cap and thank God in the place I was born, because I've lived the American dream and I've got more than I could have ever deserved.
An interesting thing about you is that you are an avid pilot. What motivated you to fly aircraft, and what types of planes have you flown as a pilot?
Well, the cover of my book has a little plane on it, which was the first plane I ever owned, and it's got three of my grandsons that are sitting on a fence rail. And that actual photo my daughter-in-law took, and then a painter converted it to a book cover for us. But that was a Piper Saratoga, and one April, I was out in South Dakota and I was with my dad, who was elderly at this point, and a little plane flew overhead. And I looked up at the plane and I pointed at it and I asked Dad, like, when was the last time that you were able to go up in an aircraft? And he said, whoa, wow, that was a long time ago. And, I was with your grandfather and we looked at all of our old pheasant hunting and duck hunting spots and the ranches and the farms that we worked on and all of our old haunts. And he kind of shook his head wistfully and he said, I'd give anything to do that again. Well, I was at the time in my, mid 40s, and I went back that April, and in May 5th, I took my first lesson. And that October, I took him flying in a Cessna 172 that I rented from Fargo Jet Center. And then I got the Saratoga to serve our work. And then one day I was flying from Bozeman, Montana to Boise, Idaho, where I now call home. And I looked down over the river of no return wilderness area. And with a single engine airplane, and if you're looking for some place to land, it is the river of no return for a reason. And so I got home and I heard the phrase that every pilot husband wants to hear your wife say is like, she heard that story and she said, I think you need a twin. So I moved up to a twin jet. It's called an Eclipse 500, and it's a twin engine. It's kind of a little sports car, but it's got two jet engines on the back, and that gets me from here to there. So, pretty lucky to be able to fly around.
Your book is titled Building Men Character Lessons from Influencers. Without spoiling too much about your nonfiction book, what is it about?
Well, I put together a list of people who had influenced me in a dramatic way. And I thought, if I get hit by a bus, I got 18 grandkids now, and some of them now I have not been able to imprint very big on because they're too young still. And if I got hit by a bus, what would I want them to know about me? Well, there are 20 chapters in this book, and each one of them details a character trait. And that character trait is something that is modeled to me by someone else. So it's just a collection of stories about the people who invested into me. And then I, in turn, am able to, spread that message, if you will, with folks that want to read the book.
I'm going to ask this question as a point of clarification more than anything. By influencers, which is the last word in the subtitle of your book, are you referring to social media influencers or something else entirely?
And this is a little bit more old school than the social media influencers, but these are people who influence me, and by that, here's what I mean. These were generally probably pretty busy people who didn't have an abundance of time, and yet they chose to carve out a little bit of their precious time and spend it encouraging me and inspiring me and teaching me lessons that help me develop into the person that I become. So it's in many ways a tip of the cap to them, but it does so in a narrative way. So it's stories about people who actually had an influence on me. And then, with the as well as it's doing on Audible, maybe I don't know if Audible's a social media now, maybe we should. That's the next influencer.
What motivated you to write Building Men?
You know, Again, I just wanted to make sure that these stories were able to be put down in writing. And one of the things that happened that really kind of pushed the envelope, if you will, or pushed the pen across the paper, maybe. I got inducted into the Wireless Hall of Fame, and when that induction happened, they told stories, and they told them as though I were the only one responsible. And that simply is not the case. When I talk about my history, I talk about, it's reflected in the book. I talk about my friends and people who have influenced me in business and family, and people who have changed my leadership style and the character traits. Like there's one in there, I mean, there's a really cool chapter about people who in the performance dog category, so working dog category, and they encouraged me in perseverance. So I wrote a chapter that said, hey, here's what happened and here's how they influenced me. So I got to be able to put those stories down so that those folks would get the true credit they deserve, and so their lessons would last longer than I did. Because if I teach this lesson one-on-one to somebody, then I'm going to teach one person's lesson. But if somebody reads this chapter, then I've taught two people. Or if they give that book to someone else, then I've taught three. Or as many copies have been sold, that's how many people I guess we have taught that lesson to.
From start to finish, how long did it take you to write Building Men?
Yeah, it only took 66 years. But I would guess that, I wasn't really gifted at sitting down at the computer and penning it out. So what I did is I actually took a headset and I told the stories into that and then had that transcribed and then edited it. And so I guess the first one, it probably took about a year, but the longest part of it was actually editing and not the writing of it, because the stories I could actually tell, but they were from a first party, I was their perspective, rather than hey, this happened to me and I want to relate to you what it felt like to be the person who received that. And so I had an editor who was fantastic. The first one was my wife, and she was a homeschool mom, so that was a great help. But then another lady came alongside, and I kept feeling that it was my own voice. They didn't change me or the story. They just made it better. And then lo and behold, at the end of the day, when it comes out, I really intended this to be a book for anybody, but I kind of expected that a man would buy this for his son, or maybe a mom would buy this for their boy or something like that, just because of the title. But the opposite happened, and now it became the number one bestseller in single parenting. And I think the message that I'm getting back is very clear. There's a need for men of character to step up and mentor young people these days, and it really looks like adding those character traits into their life by example. And this book can help with that. Then I'm thrilled, and maybe I've done something worthwhile.
Morgan James Publishing And I've interviewed quite a few authors now who have had their books published through Morgan James, but they've published Building Men. Excuse me.
Hmm.
The Burning Man Festival concluded, I think, a day or two ago. So that's how that confusion came about.
No worries.
But what was it like to work with Morgan James on getting your book published?
One of the things that I didn't expect was how much of their influence comes from experience. And I say that because I thought, you write the book and then you send it off to somebody and they just handle everything. And in many ways that's true. However, there's like anything, there's a caveat. They don't want to steal your voice. They don't want to steal your thunder. They want you to publish a book that you're proud of and that they want to hold your vision. But when they do that, they offer guidance literally at every step and at every turn. And I'll give you an example of that. I had this wonderful picture in my mind about me sitting down by a microphone and doing the audible version. And they said, well, that sounds really good. Only thing is, we kind of like you to audition for it. And I didn't get the part. And they wanted what was best for the book rather than what was best for my ego. And that really, at the end of the day, that serves the audience better. So by engaging Morgan James, I have served my audience. But there's a side benefit to that is that we inked a 3-book deal. And that first book, they liked it enough. But, as the lady who I first talked to said, I've got good news and bad news. We love your book, but your baby needs a haircut. and but their program is wonderful, I think, for first time or multiple time authors. And I couldn't be happier than to have had a publisher who was so much in my corner.
You have, if I'm not mistaken, a couple of more books in the works. Without spoiling too much about those, what will they be about?
The book number 2 is already done and it's in the editing process right now, is called Management by Cliché. And it's business proverbs that worked, is the subtitle. And it's just again, I hate to, it kind of makes it sound trite, but it's a collection of stories of people who have used cliches in business situations that reinforce points around whether it be performance or, there's some stuff about safety because of the high risk business we were in. There's lots of lessons learned, but there's nothing new in business under the sun. And these highlight some of the things that I've learned over the years, again, from people who knew a whole bunch, and then were able to deliver it in a one-line cliche. So I'm really thrilled. That'll come out probably in February.
You are a podcast host yourself. You host the Grampion podcast. The name of that is a portmanteau of grandparent and champion. What can listeners expect from a typical episode of the Grampion podcast?
Well, first I think we should say that I'm not so bold or egotistical that I would give my name that I would name myself the Grampion. My grandson Wes, I actually whooped him at a card game out at a lake cabin, and he stood up, and Wes is a pretty aggressive guy, and he said, "You're not Grandpa," and I'm like, "What? Are you kidding me?" And he said, "Well, you're not champion either." And I'm like, "Wes, come on." He goes, and he smiled. He gave that Wesley Rye smile, and he says, "You're my Grampian." And so I got given that name and it stuck, and I'm really proud of it, but I didn't give it to myself. When we started the podcast, we said, hey, I want to talk with champions. So Grandpa Chats with Champions is the Grampian. And we bring in people who talk about significant victories in their life. And by that, I don't always mean that, 20-second dopamine hit of a Super Bowl moment. Sometimes it's more of the grind and the teamwork and the perseverance and the pursuit of victory that led to some sort of achievement. And so whether it be business, sports, aviation, American culture, whatever, we have people literally from every scope and walk of life that walk in and tell stories about the price they paid to become some sort of a champion. That's what the Grampion's about.
As a public speaker, you have four pillars that define your style of speaking and your manner of presentation. What are those four pillars, and what topics do you typically speak about as a public speaker?
Well, the pillars that we've talked about were kind of formed around some of the pillars of our company, and some of those were character, quality, service, and delivery. But those are a little bit different than the characters that use public speaking. But the topics that we are able to talk about when we get up on stage, number one, it's really important that we listen. Um, because one of my best keynotes has actually come from listening to the customer. I was like, hey, you guys want me to come? I'm going to give you my 7 C's of leadership. And they're like, well, yeah, but maybe not, because the market has changed and people are really unsettled, and they're wondering if they're going to be working next week or if they're going to have a job. And so maybe you talk a little bit more about, maybe some of the uncertainty that's out in the marketplace. And so the process of listening kind of scared me there, because I thought, well, I don't know if I have a like a prepackaged keynote that I could deliver on uncertainty. But what I did know is that I had enough life experience where I could actually bring to the table um, a little bit of what I did have, and I've lived through some thunder. I've lived through 18% interest rates. I have lived through unemployment. I have lived through the market taking a dive, and this is not happening. So, what I began to understand is that uncertainty is the only thing that's certain. And so we ought to embrace it. And that has really become one of my most popular keynotes. It's called Embrace Uncertainty. And it has, and I want to really put this caveat in there, because I listen to the customer, become one of the number one keynotes that I give.
My final question for this series is going to be a follow-up question. Why do you encourage people to embrace uncertainty?
Well, because if you look at it, if people say, hey, interest rates are going to go up, you get the other half of the room, they say interest rates are going to go down. Which one is right? Well, they both are, because interest rates are going to go up and interest rates are going to go down. Well, what about if the Democrats or the Republicans get in? What's going to happen then? Well, yes. And at some point they're going to change. And so we know that's coming. And what if the dollar gets stronger? What if the dollar gets weaker? Yes, we know that's coming. And what if tariffs increase this, or they help that? Well, yeah, that's all going to be true too. So we know that the future is uncertain. But the ones who actually know that and then utilize that to prepare for either one of those natural events, because you know they're coming, if you use that uncertainty to prepare yourself and the people who you work with for it, well, wow, you're going to be more ready than the next person down the line. And so you can either sit and fret about it and wring your hands, or you can actually be steadfast and show a little courage and prepare for it, so that when it inevitably comes, not only are you ready, but the people around you are going to have some trust in your leadership. So if you embrace uncertainty, then you're going to prepare for uncertainty, and you know it's coming. So why not embrace it? That's really what happened.
Jim, you were an insightful guest, and I thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate your time and carving it out for me, and I appreciate your listeners so much. People who are smart enough to listen to this podcast are probably readers, and readers are leaders.
This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.